The rain fell softly on the expensive black cars lined up outside St. Matthew's Cathedral. Inside the grand church, hundreds of people dressed in dark clothes sat quietly in wooden pews. At the front of the church, a beautiful mahogany casket was covered with white roses and lilies. The smell of flowers filled the air, mixing with the sound of quiet crying and whispered prayers. Margaret Whitmore had been dead for 3 days. At least, that's what everyone believed. The billionaire Richard Whitmore sat in the front row, his face showing no emotion. His perfectly pressed black suit and polished shoes made him look like a statue. Next to him sat his son David, a man in his 30s who kept checking his expensive watch. David's wife Sarah dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, though her tears seemed forced. Behind them sat dozens of business partners, politicians, and society friends who had come to pay their respects to the Whitmore family. Richard Whitmore owned half the city. His construction company had built most of the tall buildings downtown. His real estate business controlled thousands of apartments and office buildings. His name was on hospitals, schools, and parks throughout the state. People said he was worth over $2 billion, though nobody knew the exact amount except his accountants. Margaret had been his wife for 35 years. She had been a quiet woman who stayed out of the public eye. While Richard attended business meetings and charity galas, Margaret preferred to stay home with her books and garden. She rarely gave interviews and almost never appeared in society magazines. Most people in the city knew Richard Whitmore's face, but few would recognize his wife if they passed her on the street. The official story was simple. Margaret had suffered a massive heart attack 3 days ago while working in her garden. The family doctor, Dr. Peterson, had been called immediately. He arrived to find Margaret unconscious on the ground near her rose bushes. Despite his efforts, he could not revive her. She was pronounced dead at 3:47 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. The funeral arrangements had been handled quickly and efficiently. Richard's personal assistant had contacted the best funeral home in the city. The church had been reserved, flowers ordered, and hundreds of invitations sent out. Everything was perfect, just as Richard liked all his business dealings to be perfect. But Margaret Whitmore was not dead. 2 miles away from the cathedral, in the basement of an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, Margaret lay on a dirty mattress. Her hands were tied behind her back with rough rope. A piece of tape covered her mouth. Her expensive dress was torn and stained. Her gray hair, usually perfectly styled, was messy and tangled. She had been awake for 2 hours, though she pretended to still be unconscious. Her captors had given her some kind of drug that made her sleep for a long time. When she first woke up, everything was blurry, and she felt sick to her stomach. Slowly, her mind became clearer, and she began to understand what had happened to her. Margaret remembered working in her garden that Tuesday afternoon. She had been planting new roses near the back fence when she heard footsteps behind her. Before she could turn around, someone had grabbed her and pressed a cloth over her face. The cloth smelled sweet and chemical. She tried to fight, but the drug made her weak and dizzy. Everything went black. Now she was here, wherever here was. The basement was cold and damp. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. She could hear traffic in the distance, but it was muffled and far away. Through a small window near the ceiling, she could see that it was daytime, but she had no idea what day it was or how long she had been unconscious. Margaret tried to move, but the ropes were tight around her wrists. Her shoulders ached from lying in the same position for so long. Her mouth was dry under the tape, and she felt thirsty and hungry. But more than anything, she felt confused and frightened. Who had done this to her? Why had they taken her? What did they want? She thought about Richard and wondered if he was looking for her. Had he called the police? Was there a search going on right now? Surely someone would have noticed that she was missing. Their housekeeper, Rosa, came to work every morning at 8 o'clock. When Rosa found that Margaret wasn't in the house, she would have called Richard immediately. But as Margaret lay there in the darkness, she began to remember strange things about that Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Peterson had arrived very quickly after she was grabbed. Too quickly. It usually took him at least 20 minutes to drive from his office to their house. But she had heard his voice only a few minutes after she was taken. How was that possible unless he was already nearby? And there was something else. Just before someone grabbed her, She had heard Richard's voice talking to someone near the house. She had assumed he was on a phone call, which was normal for him. Richard was always on the phone conducting business. But now she wondered who he had been talking to and why he was home in the middle of the afternoon when he was supposed to be at his office downtown. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to think clearly. Nothing made sense. Why would anyone want to kidnap her? Richard was the one with all the money and power. She was just a quiet housewife who spent her time reading and gardening. She didn't have any enemies or secrets that anyone would care about. Unless this wasn't really about her at all. Back at the cathedral, the minister was speaking about Margaret's life and character. He talked about her kindness and generosity, though he had only met her a few times at church functions. Most of what he said came from notes that Richard's assistant had prepared for him. The minister described Margaret as a devoted wife and caring member of the community who would be greatly missed by everyone who knew her. Richard sat perfectly still during the speech, his face showing nothing. He didn't cry or show any emotion. Some people in the church thought this was strange, but others knew that Richard Whitmore was a man who kept his feelings private. He had built his business empire by being tough and controlled. It made sense that he would handle his grief the same way. But David, Richard's son, was watching his father carefully. Something felt wrong about this whole situation. David had tried to see his mother's body at the funeral home, but Richard had insisted on a closed casket. He said that Margaret would have wanted to be remembered as she was in life, not as she looked in death. Dr. Peterson had supported this decision, saying that Margaret's heart attack had been very severe and traumatic. David found this explanation odd. His mother had always been in good health. She ate well, exercised regularly by working in her garden, and had never shown any signs of heart problems. Just last month, she had passed her annual physical examination with no issues. How could someone so healthy suddenly die from a massive heart attack? There were other strange things too. Richard had arranged the funeral very quickly, only 3 days after Margaret's supposed death. Usually, families took a week or more to plan such an elaborate service. Richard had also hired extra security for the church, saying he wanted to keep reporters and curiosity seekers away. But Margaret wasn't a public figure, so why would reporters be interested in her funeral? The most puzzling thing was Rosa, their longtime housekeeper. She had worked for the family for over 15 years and loved Margaret like a daughter. Rosa should have been devastated by Margaret's death, but David noticed that she hadn't come to the funeral. When he asked his father about this, Richard said that Rosa was too upset to attend and had asked for some time off to grieve privately. This didn't sound like Rosa at all. She was a strong woman who faced problems head-on. David couldn't imagine her missing Margaret's funeral, no matter how upset she was. He decided that after the service, he would drive to Rosa's house to check on her and offer his condolences. As the minister continued his speech, David's wife, Sarah, squeezed his hand. She had noticed his distraction and was trying to offer comfort. Sarah assumed that David was simply having trouble dealing with his mother's sudden death. She had no idea that David was beginning to suspect that something was terribly wrong with the entire situation. In the pew behind the family, Dr. Peterson sat with his wife. He looked nervous and kept wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air conditioning in the church. His hands shook slightly as he held his program, and he kept glancing around the room as if he was looking for someone or something. Dr. Peterson had been the Whitmore family doctor for over 20 years. He was a respected physician with an excellent reputation in the community. He had delivered David when he was born and had treated the family through countless minor illnesses and injuries over the years. Margaret had trusted him completely, which made what he had done even more difficult for him to live with. The doctor thought back to Tuesday afternoon when Richard had called him with an unusual request. Richard said that he needed Dr. Peterson to come to the house immediately and to bring a specific type of sedative with him. Richard claimed that Margaret was having some kind of nervous breakdown and needed to be calmed down before she hurt herself or someone else. This had seemed strange to Dr. Peterson because Margaret was one of the most mentally stable people he knew. She was quiet and thoughtful, not the type of person who would have a breakdown. But Richard had been insistent, and he was paying Dr. Peterson a very large amount of money for this special house call. When Dr. Peterson arrived at the Whitmore house, he found Margaret unconscious in the garden. Richard explained that she had collapsed after he gave her a mild sedative to calm her down. Richard said the sedative had been stronger than expected and asked Dr. Peterson to examine Margaret and determine what should be done next. Dr. Peterson had been suspicious immediately. Margaret's pulse and breathing were normal, but she was unconscious in a way that seemed more like deep sleep than a medical emergency. Her color was good, and there were no signs of distress. This didn't look like a heart attack or any other serious medical condition. But before Dr. Peterson could examine Margaret more thoroughly, Richard had pulled him aside. Richard explained that Margaret had discovered some embarrassing information about Richard's business dealings. She was threatening to go to the authorities and expose him. Richard said that he couldn't let this happen because it would destroy not only his business, but also his son's future and the jobs of thousands of employees. Richard told Dr. Peterson that they needed to fake Margaret's death and hide her somewhere until Richard could figure out how to handle the situation. Richard promised that Margaret wouldn't be hurt and that this was only a temporary solution. He offered Dr. Peterson $500,000 to help with the plan and to sign a death certificate saying that Margaret had died of a heart attack. Dr. Peterson knew that what Richard was asking was illegal and wrong. But Richard had been his friend for many years, and the doctor was facing serious financial problems of his own. His medical practice was struggling, and he owed a large amount of money to several creditors. The $500,000 would solve all his problems and allow him to keep his practice open. So Dr. Peterson had agreed to the plan. He signed the death certificate and helped Richard move Margaret's unconscious body to a car. Richard assured him that Margaret was being taken to a safe place where she would be comfortable until the situation could be resolved. Now, sitting in the church and listening to Margaret's funeral service, Dr. Peterson was filled with regret and fear. He realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He didn't really know what Richard had done with Margaret or whether she was safe. He was beginning to suspect that Richard had lied to him about everything. The minister was finishing his remarks and asking the congregation to bow their heads for a final prayer. As people lowered their heads and closed their eyes, Dr. Peterson looked around the church one more time. In the back corner, near the door, he noticed a woman standing alone. She was wearing a simple black dress and had her head covered with a dark scarf. Something about her looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place where he had seen her before. The woman was Rosa Martinez, the Whitmore family's housekeeper. She had not been invited to the funeral, but she couldn't stay away. She loved Margaret like family and needed to say goodbye, even if she had to do it secretly from the back of the church. Rosa knew that something was very wrong with this whole situation. On Tuesday afternoon, she had seen Richard's car parked in an unusual spot near the side of the house. She had also noticed Dr. Peterson's car arriving much earlier than Richard had claimed when he called to report Margaret's death. Rosa had worked for wealthy families for most of her life, and she had learned to notice details that others might miss. The cemetery was located on a hill overlooking the city. Tall oak trees provided shade for the hundreds of headstones that marked the graves of the wealthy and powerful families who had shaped the region for generations. The Whitmore family plot was in the most exclusive section, where the monuments were larger and more elaborate than anywhere else in the cemetery. A green tent had been set up over the open grave where Margaret's casket was supposed to be lowered into the ground. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows for the family and closest friends. The rest of the mourners stood in a semicircle around the gravesite, their dark clothing creating a somber scene against the bright green grass. Richard stood next to the casket with his hand resting on the polished wood. To everyone watching, he looked like a man saying his final goodbye to his beloved wife. But inside the casket was not Margaret's body. Instead, Richard had filled it with bags of sand and rocks to give it the proper weight. A few personal items of Margaret's had been placed on top to create the illusion that she was really there. David watched his father carefully during the graveside service. Something in Richard's behavior continued to bother him. Richard seemed too calm, too controlled for someone who had just lost his wife of 35 years. David had expected to see some sign of genuine grief, but Richard looked more like he was attending a business meeting than burying his spouse. The minister spoke briefly about dust returning to dust and ashes to ashes. He offered a final prayer for Margaret's soul and for comfort for her family. Then came the moment when the casket was supposed to be lowered into the ground. The cemetery workers began operating the mechanical device that would lower the heavy casket. Slowly, the mahogany box descended into the earth. Richard threw a handful of dirt onto the casket, followed by David and Sarah. Other family members and close friends did the same. The sound of dirt hitting wood echoed in the quiet cemetery. But, as the service was ending, something unexpected happened. A commotion broke out near the back of the crowd. People were turning and pointing toward the cemetery's main road. A small, beat-up car had driven through the gates and was speeding up the hill toward the gravesite. The car screeched to a halt about 50 feet from the burial site. The driver's door opened, and Rosa Martinez stepped out. She was still wearing her simple black dress, but now her face showed determination instead of grief. She walked quickly toward the crowd of mourners, ignoring the security guards who moved to intercept her. "Stop!" Rosa shouted in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't bury that casket." The mourners turned to stare at her in shock. Who was this woman? And why was she interrupting such a solemn ceremony? The security guards reached Rosa and tried to grab her arms, but she pulled away from them. "That casket is empty," Rosa continued, her voice carrying across the cemetery. "Margaret Whitmore is not dead. She's alive." A gasp went through the crowd. People began murmuring to each other, asking who this woman was and what she was talking about. Some of the elderly mourners looked shocked and confused. Others appeared angry that someone would disrupt such an important funeral. Richard's face went white. For the first time all day, he showed a genuine emotional reaction. His carefully controlled expression cracked, and, for just a moment, everyone could see fear in his eyes. Then, he quickly recovered his composure and stepped forward. "Security, remove this woman immediately," Richard commanded in a sharp voice. "She's obviously disturbed and doesn't know what she's saying." But David was staring at Rosa with recognition. He knew who she was now. This was the family's housekeeper, the woman his father had claimed was too upset to attend the funeral. Rosa had worked in their house for 15 years and knew the family better than almost anyone else. She wouldn't make such a dramatic accusation unless she had a good reason. "Wait," David said, stepping between Rosa and the security guards. "I know this woman. She's our housekeeper. Let her speak." Rosa looked directly at David, grateful for his intervention. "Mr. David, your mother is alive. I saw things on Tuesday that didn't make sense. Your father is lying about what happened to Mrs. Whitmore." Richard's face turned red with anger. "This woman is obviously having some kind of mental breakdown," he said loudly. "She's been acting strangely since Margaret's death. Don't listen to her nonsense." But Rosa wasn't finished. She pulled a small digital camera from her purse and held it up for everyone to see. "I have pictures," she announced. "Pictures of what really happened on Tuesday afternoon." The crowd fell completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing in the trees above them. Everyone's attention was focused on the small camera in Rosa's hands. "On Tuesday morning, I heard Mr. Whitmore on the phone," Rosa continued. "He was talking about taking care of what he called the Margaret problem. He said she was going to destroy everything if she wasn't stopped." David felt his stomach drop. This was exactly the kind of thing he had been worried about. His father was ruthless in business, but David had never imagined that Richard would do anything to harm his own wife. "That's a lie," Richard shouted. "This woman is trying to blackmail our family. She probably wants money." But Dr. Peterson, who had been standing quietly near the back of the crowd, suddenly stepped forward. His face was pale, and he looked like he might be sick. "Richard, stop," he said in a shaky voice. "We need to tell the truth." All eyes turned to Dr. Peterson. Richard stared at him with a look of pure fury. "Peterson, you don't know what you're saying," Richard warned. "You're as confused as she is." But Dr. Peterson had reached his breaking point. The guilt had been eating at him for 3 days, and now he couldn't keep the secret any longer. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice getting stronger. "Margaret Whitmore is alive. I helped fake her death certificate." The crowd erupted in shocked voices. Some people gasped. Others began talking loudly to each other. Several mourners looked like they might faint from the revelation. The security guards didn't know what to do. They had been hired to keep troublemakers away from the funeral, not to deal with accusations of fake death. David grabbed his father's arm. "Dad, What is he talking about? Where's my mother? Richard tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beginning to show on his forehead. These people are both lying, he insisted. They're trying to cause trouble for our family for their own reasons. But Rosa held up her camera again. I have pictures of Dr. Peterson's car arriving at your house 30 minutes before you called to report Mrs. Whitmore's death, she said. I also have pictures of you and 2 other men carrying something heavy from the garden to a van that was parked behind your house. David felt like the world was spinning around him. Rosa, are you saying my father kidnapped my mother? I'm saying your mother discovered something that your father didn't want her to tell anyone, Rosa replied. And instead of letting her speak, he decided to make everyone think she was dead. Dr. Peterson nodded his head. She's right, he said quietly. Richard told me that Margaret found out about some of his business dealings and was threatening to go to the authorities. He said he needed to hide her until he could figure out how to handle the situation. Richard looked around at the crowd of mourners, seeing that many of them were beginning to believe Rosa and Dr. Peterson. His reputation and his freedom were slipping away with every word they spoke. This is ridiculous, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Even if what they're saying were true, which it's not, where would Margaret be? They can't prove anything. Rosa smiled grimly. I followed the van that left your house on Tuesday, she said. I know where they took her. Meanwhile, in the basement of the abandoned warehouse, Margaret had been working on freeing herself for hours. The ropes around her wrists were tight, but she had found a sharp edge on the concrete wall where she could rub the rope back and forth. It was slow, painful work that cut into her skin, but gradually the fibers were beginning to weaken. Margaret had also been listening carefully to the sounds around her. She could tell that she was near a busy road because of the constant traffic noise. Every so often, she heard the sound of a train in the distance, which meant she was probably close to the railroad tracks that ran through the industrial part of the city. She had also heard footsteps upstairs several times during the day. At least 2 different people were guarding her, though she hadn't seen them clearly. They had checked on her once, but she had pretended to still be unconscious. One of them had said something about keeping her drugged until the boss decided what to do with her permanently. This had terrified Margaret. She realized that Richard's plan might not be to keep her hidden temporarily. He might be planning to kill her for real once the funeral was over, and everyone believed she was already dead. She needed to escape before that happened. The tape over her mouth was another problem. It was wrapped tightly, and she couldn't remove it while her hands were tied. But she had discovered that by working her jaw muscles and moving her tongue, she could loosen the tape slightly. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to call for help if she got the chance. As Margaret continued working on the ropes, she thought about what she had discovered that had led to this situation. 3 weeks ago, she had been organizing Richard's home office while he was out of town. She was looking for some old tax documents when she found a folder hidden behind some books. Inside the folder were bank statements and financial records that showed Richard had been stealing money from several of his business partners and clients. He had also been involved in a scheme to overcharge the city for construction projects, keeping the extra money for himself. The amount of stolen money was in the millions of dollars. Margaret had been shocked and heartbroken. She had known that Richard could be tough and aggressive in business, but she had never imagined that he would steal from people who trusted him. Some of his victims were pension funds and charities that couldn't afford to lose the money. Margaret had confronted Richard about the documents when he returned from his trip. She told him that he needed to return the stolen money and turn himself in to the authorities. Richard had laughed at her and said that she didn't understand how business worked in the real world. Margaret had given Richard 1 week to do the right thing. When he refused, she made plans to take the evidence to the FBI herself. She had contacted an agent and arranged to meet with him on Wednesday, the day after her supposed death. Now Margaret understood why Richard had been so desperate to stop her. If the FBI investigated his business dealings, Richard would go to prison for a very long time. His company would be shut down, and all his assets would be seized by the government. He would lose everything he had spent his life building. But Margaret had underestimated how far Richard would go to protect himself. She had never imagined that he would fake her death and hold her prisoner. She was beginning to realize that the man she had been married to for 35 years was capable of much worse things than she had ever suspected. Back at the cemetery, The situation was spiraling out of Richard's control. More and more mourners were beginning to believe Rose's accusations. David was demanding answers, and Dr. Peterson was confirming Rose's story. Richard knew that he needed to end this confrontation quickly before it completely destroyed him. "Even if you believe these wild stories," Richard said, trying to sound reasonable, "what do you propose we do? You can't just stop a funeral based on the accusations of a disturbed housekeeper and a confused doctor." But David had heard enough. He walked over to the grave where his mother's casket had been partially lowered. "If these accusations are false, then you won't mind if we open the casket and prove that mother is really inside." Richard's face went completely white. "David, that's impossible. Your mother wouldn't want to be disturbed. It would be disrespectful to her memory. If she's really dead, then she won't mind," David replied firmly. "But if this casket is empty, then we're going to find out where you've hidden her." Rosa stepped forward and handed David a key. "This is the key to the warehouse where I followed the van," she said. "It's about 2 miles from here, on Industrial Boulevard near the railroad tracks." Richard made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. He turned to the crowd of mourners and raised his voice. "I'm asking all of you to remember the dignity and respect we owe to Margaret's memory. Don't let these people turn this sacred ceremony into a circus." His shoulders sagged as he realized that his plan had completely fallen apart. In a matter of minutes, everyone would know what he had done. David opened the casket. Inside, instead of his mother's body, were several bags of sand, and Rose's old car raced down the winding cemetery road with David and Sarah following close behind in their Mercedes. Behind them, Dr. Peterson had joined the convoy in his own vehicle, his medical bag on the passenger seat in case Margaret needed immediate care. The 3-car caravan sped through the city streets toward Industrial Boulevard, while other mourners called 911 from the cemetery. Richard had been tackled by security guards before he could reach his limousine. He was now being held at the cemetery while police were on their way. "Bring tools to break locks and any friends you trust. A woman's life is in danger." Miguel didn't ask questions. His Aunt Rosa had raised him after his parents died, and he would do anything she asked. "I'll be there in 10 minutes with my crew," he promised. Meanwhile, at the warehouse, Margaret had finally managed to weaken the rope enough to slip one hand free. The rough concrete had cut her wrists badly, but she ignored the pain. With one hand loose, she was able to untie the rest of the rope and remove the tape from her mouth. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs weak from being in the same position for so long. She looked around the basement, searching for a way to escape. There was a wooden staircase leading up to the main floor, but she could hear voices and footsteps above her. At least 2 men were still guarding the building. She examined the small window near the ceiling, but it was too high to reach and probably too small for her to fit through anyway. The basement walls were solid concrete with no other openings. The only way out was through the upstairs, which meant she would have to get past her captors. Margaret searched the basement for anything she could use as a weapon. In one corner, she found some old tools left behind by the previous owner. There was a heavy wrench that she could carry and a screwdriver that could be used to defend herself if necessary. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She also found an old paint can that was empty but still made noise when shaken. Margaret had an idea. If she could create a distraction at one end of the building, she might be able to escape through a different exit while her guards were investigating the noise. Upstairs, Tony Marcelli and Jake Stevens were playing cards at a small table near the front door. They had been hired by Richard to guard Margaret until he decided what to do with her permanently. Both men were experienced criminals who had worked for Richard before on various illegal projects. Tony was a large man in his 40s who had spent time in prison for armed robbery. Jake was younger and smaller, but had a reputation for violence when cornered. Neither man knew the full details of Richard's plan, and they didn't care. They were being paid well to keep one woman locked in a basement, which seemed like easy money. "How long do you think the old man wants us to keep her here?" Jake asked as he dealt another hand of cards. Tony shrugged. "As long as he's paying us, I don't ask questions. Could be days, could be weeks. What if she gets sick or something? We're not babysitters." "That's not our problem," Tony replied. "Richard said to keep her quiet and out of sight. That's what we're doing." Jake looked toward the basement door. "She's been quiet for a long time. Maybe we should check on her. Tony waved his hand dismissively. She's probably still sleeping off that drug they gave her. Doc said it would keep her out for most of the day. But, as Tony spoke, both men heard a loud crash from somewhere in the building. It sounded like metal falling on concrete. They looked at each other with alarm. What was that? Jake whispered. Tony grabbed his gun from the table and motioned for Jake to do the same. Sounded like it came from the back of the building. Go check it out. Jake moved cautiously toward the rear of the warehouse, while Tony stayed near the front door. Neither man thought to check the basement immediately, which was exactly what Margaret had hoped would happen. Margaret had thrown the paint can as hard as she could toward the far end of the basement, where it hit a pile of old metal pipes and created a loud noise. Now she crept quietly up the wooden stairs, hoping that both guards would be distracted long enough for her to reach the main floor. The staircase was old, and some of the boards creaked under her weight. Margaret moved as carefully as possible, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. She could hear footsteps moving around on the floor above her, but they seemed to be heading away from the basement entrance. When Margaret reached the top of the stairs, she found herself behind a partially open door. Through the crack, she could see part of the warehouse's main floor. It was a large, empty space with concrete floors and metal support beams. Sunlight streamed through dirty windows high up on the walls. Margaret could see Jake moving toward the back of the building with a gun in his hand. She couldn't see Tony, but she could hear him talking on a cell phone somewhere near the front of the building. This was her chance to escape, but she needed to move quickly before they realized the noise had been a diversion. Margaret pushed the basement door open just wide enough to slip through. She found herself behind a large concrete pillar that provided some cover. From here, she could see the main entrance to the warehouse about 50 feet away. Tony was standing near the door with his back to her, still talking on his phone. Margaret knew she had only seconds before Jake returned from investigating the noise. She took a deep breath and made her move, running as quietly as possible from pillar to pillar across the warehouse floor. The heavy wrench in her hand gave her some confidence, but she knew that against two armed men, her only real chance was to reach the door without being seen. She had made it halfway across the warehouse when Tony ended his phone call and turned around. For a moment, their eyes met across the empty space. Tony's face showed complete shock as he realized that his prisoner had escaped. "Jake!" Tony shouted. "She's loose. She's heading for the door." Margaret abandoned any attempt at stealth and ran as fast as she could toward the exit. Tony raised his gun and fired a shot that missed her by inches. The bullet hit the concrete wall near her head, sending chips flying. Margaret reached the door and grabbed the handle, but it was locked. She fumbled with the deadbolt while Tony ran toward her, shouting threats. Behind her, she could hear Jake's footsteps as he rushed back from the rear of the building. Just as Margaret got the door unlocked, she heard the sound of car engines outside. Through the dirty window, she could see Rosa's old car pulling into the warehouse parking lot, followed by David's Mercedes and Dr. Peterson's sedan. Behind them was a pickup truck filled with several young men carrying tools and equipment. Margaret yanked the door open and stumbled outside just as Rosa jumped out of her car. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rosa shouted with relief and joy. "Thank God you're alive." David ran toward his mother, but Margaret waved him back. "They have guns," she warned. Two men inside. Tony appeared in the doorway behind Margaret, his weapon raised. But before he could fire, Miguel and his friends had surrounded the building. Miguel, who had served in the military before becoming a security guard, knew how to handle dangerous situations. "Drop your weapon," Miguel commanded, pointing his own licensed pistol at Tony. "Police are on the way." Tony looked around and realized he was outnumbered and trapped. Jake appeared behind him in the doorway, also armed but clearly nervous about the situation. They had signed up to guard a helpless woman, not to fight a group of determined men in broad daylight. "This is not worth it," Jake muttered to Tony. "Richard's not paying us enough to get killed." Tony slowly lowered his gun. He and Jake had criminal records that would make any charges against them very serious. If they surrendered now, they might be able to make a deal with prosecutors by testifying against Richard. Within minutes, the warehouse parking lot was filled with police cars and an ambulance. Margaret was examined by paramedics and found to be in relatively good condition despite her ordeal. She had cuts on her wrist from the rope and was dehydrated, but she was alert and able to talk clearly. David held his mother's hand as she sat in the ambulance receiving treatment. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said with tears in his eyes. "I should have known something was wrong. I should have protected you from him." Margaret squeezed her son's hand. "This is not your fault, David. I never imagined your father was capable of something like this either." Dr. Peterson approached the ambulance, looking ashamed and nervous. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to apologize to you," he said quietly. "I helped your husband with this terrible plan. I signed a false death certificate and helped them take you. I have no excuse except that I was desperate for money." Margaret looked at the doctor who had delivered her son and cared for her family for 20 years. She felt angry and betrayed, but she also saw that he was genuinely remorseful. "Dr. Peterson, what you did was wrong and illegal, but at least you came forward and told the truth when it mattered. That took some courage." Dr. Peterson nodded gratefully. He knew he would face serious legal consequences for his actions, but at least Margaret was alive and safe. Rosa stood nearby, watching the reunion between Margaret and David. She felt proud that she had trusted her instincts and acted on them, but she was also worried about what would happen next. Richard Whitmore was a powerful man with many connections. Even though his plan had failed, he might still find ways to cause trouble for the people who had exposed him. Police Detective Sarah Walsh arrived at the scene to take statements from everyone involved. Detective Walsh was an experienced investigator who had dealt with many complex cases involving wealthy and powerful suspects. The papers showed that Richard had been stealing money from his business partners and overbilling clients for construction projects. The amounts involved were in the millions of dollars. Detective Walsh took careful notes as Margaret described confronting Richard about the theft and threatening to turn him in to the authorities. She explained about the meeting she had scheduled with the FBI for Wednesday, the day after her supposed death. "Do you still have those documents?" Detective Walsh asked. Margaret shook her head. "They were in a folder in Richard's home office. He probably destroyed them as soon as he realized I had found them." "That's okay," Detective Walsh assured her. "If the theft really happened, there will be other evidence. Bank records, canceled checks, invoices that don't match actual work performed. Financial crimes leave paper trails that are very hard to completely erase." Tony Marcelli and Jake Stevens were arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. Both men decided to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. They provided detailed statements about Richard's instructions to them and the payments they had received for guarding Margaret. 3 days after her rescue, Margaret Whitmore sat in the office of FBI agent Jennifer Chun, surrounded by boxes of documents and evidence that would determine her husband's fate. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of medical examinations, police interviews, and media attention that had turned her quiet life completely upside down. Agent Chun was a specialist in financial crimes who had been investigating white-collar criminals for over 15 years. She had seen many cases involving wealthy individuals who thought their money and power put them above the law, but Richard Whitmore's case was unique in its boldness and cruelty. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to know that we've already found substantial evidence to support your allegations against your husband," Agent Chen said as she opened the first box of documents. "Our forensic accountants have been working around the clock since your rescue." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the evidence still existed, but sadness that her life with Richard had been built on lies and stolen money. "What kind of evidence did you find?" Agent Chen pulled out several thick folders. "Bank records showing unusual transfers between your husband's personal accounts and his business accounts. Invoices to the city that don't match the actual costs of construction materials. Contracts with business partners that were altered after they were signed to give Richard a larger share of profits." Margaret studied the documents with amazement. Richard was always so careful about his paperwork. "I'm surprised he left evidence behind." "That's the thing about financial crimes," Agent Chen explained. "They require so many transactions and documents that it's almost impossible to hide everything. Your husband was careful, but he wasn't perfect, and he never expected anyone to look this closely at his business dealings." Over the next several hours, Agent Chen walked Margaret through the evidence that had been collected. The scope of Richard's crimes was much larger than Margaret had originally discovered. He had been stealing money for at least 10 years, starting with small amounts that gradually grew into millions of dollars. Richard had been particularly clever about targeting victims who were unlikely to notice the theft immediately. He had overbilled pension funds and charitable organizations that trusted him to manage construction projects honestly. He had also created fake companies that existed only on paper, then paid those companies for work that was never actually performed. The total amount of stolen money appears to be around $12 million, Agent Chin revealed. That doesn't include the profits he made by investing the stolen funds in other business ventures. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. $12 million stolen from people and organizations who had trusted Richard. Some of that money had paid for the luxury lifestyle she had enjoyed without knowing it was built on crime. The expensive house, the fine clothes, the exotic vacations, all of it tainted by theft. What happens to the money now? Margaret asked. We'll work to recover as much as possible and return it to the victims, Agent Chin assured her. Your husband's assets will be frozen while the investigation continues. That includes bank accounts, real estate, investments, and business holdings. Margaret realized that this meant she would lose almost everything too. The house where she had lived for 20 years, her savings account, even her car might be seized if they were purchased with stolen money. But she didn't care about the financial loss. Her freedom and her integrity were worth more than any amount of money. There's something else I need to discuss with you, Agent Chin continued. We believe your husband may have been planning to kill you permanently, not just keep you hidden until the situation blew over. Margaret felt a chill run through her body. What makes you think that? Agent Chin pulled out a transcript of a recorded phone conversation. We got a court order to tap your husband's phone after his arrest. Yesterday, he made a call to someone we believe is a professional killer. He was asking about arranging a permanent solution to what he called loose ends. Margaret stared at the transcript in horror. Even after his arrest, Richard was still trying to have her killed to prevent her from testifying against him. The man she had been married to for 35 years was a complete stranger to her now. Don't worry, Agent Chin added quickly. He's being held without bail, and all his phone calls are monitored. He can't hurt you anymore. But this to show how serious he is about silencing you. Margaret thought about David and how this revelation would affect him. Learning that his father was a thief had been devastating enough. Now David would have to accept that Richard had also been planning to murder his own wife. Some betrayals were so deep that families never recovered from them. Meanwhile, across town in the county jail, Richard Whitmore was meeting with his attorney, Marcus Webb. Webb was one of the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in the state, known for his ability to get wealthy clients out of seemingly impossible legal situations. Richard, I'm going to be direct with you, Webb said as he spread legal documents across the small table in the jail's conference room. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The FBI has your financial records, your accomplices are cooperating with prosecutors, and your wife is alive to testify against you. Richard looked older than his 62 years. 3 days in jail had stripped away his polished businessman appearance. His expensive suit had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, and his perfectly styled hair was now messy and unkempt. What are you saying, Marcus? That I should just give up? Webb sighed. I'm saying we need to consider a plea agreement. The prosecution is willing to discuss a deal where you plead guilty to the financial crimes in exchange for dropping the kidnapping and attempted murder charges. Richard laughed bitterly. And how much prison time are we talking about? Probably 15 to 20 years with good behavior. At your age, that's essentially a life sentence. Richard was quiet for several minutes, thinking about his options. He had built his entire life around being in control, making decisions that affected other people's lives and fortunes. Now he was powerless, sitting in a jail cell while strangers decided his fate. What if Margaret were to have an accident before she can testify? Richard asked quietly. Webb looked at his client with alarm. Richard, stop talking right now. That kind of thinking is exactly what got you into this situation. The FBI is already monitoring all your communications. If you make any threats against your wife, you'll face additional charges that will guarantee you never see freedom again. Richard realized that Webb was right, but he felt trapped and desperate. Everything he had worked for his entire life was being destroyed by a woman he had considered weak and naive. Margaret had always seemed content to stay in the background while he made all the important decisions. He never expected her to have the courage to challenge him. The truth was that Richard had been underestimating Margaret for years. While he was focused on building his business empire, she had been quietly observing and learning about his methods. She understood his business better than he realized, which was why she had been able to recognize the evidence of theft so quickly. Back at the FBI office, Margaret was meeting with David and Sarah to discuss the future. The media attention had made it impossible for any of them to return to their normal lives. Reporters were camped outside the family home, and every time Margaret appeared in public, she was surrounded by cameras and microphones. "Mom, I think you should consider writing a book about what happened," David suggested. "People are fascinated by this story, and you could control the narrative instead of letting reporters speculate about details they don't understand." Margaret was skeptical. "I've never been comfortable with publicity, David. The idea of sharing such personal details with the whole world feels very difficult." Sarah, who worked in marketing, had a different perspective. "Margaret, whether you like it or not, this story is going to be told. There will probably be movies and documentaries made about what happened. If you don't tell your own version, other people will tell theirs, and it might not be accurate." Margaret considered this advice. She had already received calls from several publishers and movie producers who wanted to buy the rights to her story. The amounts of money being offered were substantial, enough to help compensate the victims of Richard's theft. "If I did write a book," Margaret said slowly, "I would want all the profits to go to the people Richard stole from. I don't want to make money from this situation." David smiled at his mother's generosity. Even after everything she had been through, her first thought was helping others rather than helping herself. This was the woman he remembered from his childhood, kind, ethical, and always thinking about how her actions would affect other people. Agent Chen interrupted their conversation with news about the investigation. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've discovered something important that I think you should know about. We found evidence that your husband was planning this kidnapping for several weeks before you discovered the financial documents." Margaret looked confused. "What do you mean?" "He didn't know I had found anything until I confronted him about it." "Actually, he did know," Agent Chen explained. "We found emails between Richard and a private investigator he hired to monitor your activities. The investigator was watching your movements and reporting back to Richard about what you were doing." Margaret felt violated all over again. Not only had Richard stolen money and faked her death, but he had been spying on her for weeks. Every phone call, every trip to the store, every conversation with friends had been watched and reported back to her own husband. "The private investigator's reports show that Richard knew you had been in his office looking through files," Agent Chen continued. "He also knew that you had contacted the FBI to arrange a meeting. Your confrontation with him was not a surprise to him. He was already planning how to stop you." This revelation changed Margaret's understanding of what had happened to her. Richard hadn't acted impulsively when she threatened to expose him. He had carefully planned her kidnapping and fake death as soon as he realized she was a threat to him. The man she had been married to was not just a thief, but a calculating criminal who had been manipulating her for much longer than she had realized. Dr. Peterson had also been cooperating fully with investigators. He had provided detailed information about Richard's plan and his own role in carrying it out. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors had agreed to recommend a reduced sentence, though he would still face significant prison time for his crimes. "I want to apologize to you again, Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Peterson said when Margaret agreed to meet with him at the FBI office. "I was desperate for money because of some bad investments, but that's no excuse for what I did. I helped a man fake his wife's death and hide her from her family. I violated my oath as a doctor and betrayed the trust you placed in me for 20 years. Margaret looked at the man who had delivered her son and cared for her family's medical needs for 2 decades. She felt angry and hurt, but she also felt some sympathy for him. Unlike Richard, Dr. Peterson seemed genuinely remorseful about his actions. "Dr. Peterson, what you did was unforgivable," Margaret said firmly. "But I can see that you understand the seriousness of your actions. I hope that when you get out of prison, you find a way to make amends and rebuild your life in an honest way." Dr. Peterson nodded gratefully. He knew that Margaret's forgiveness didn't change the legal consequences he would face, but It meant something to him that she didn't hate him completely. The investigation was also revealing the full extent of Rosa's heroism in exposing Richard's plan. Security cameras from businesses near the Whitmore house had captured images of Rosa following the van that carried Margaret to the warehouse. The FBI was able to track the van's route and confirm Rosa's story about how she discovered Margaret's location. "Mrs. Martinez, your actions probably saved Mrs. Whitmore's life," Agent Chin told Rosa during her interview. "If you hadn't spoken up at the funeral, Richard's plan might have succeeded." Rosa was uncomfortable with being called a hero. "I just did what anyone would do for family," she said simply. "Mrs. Whitmore has been good to me for 15 years. I couldn't let someone hurt her when I had the power to help." But Agent Chin knew that Rosa's actions had required tremendous courage. Speaking up at the funeral meant risking her job, her reputation, and potentially her safety if Richard's accomplices had decided to silence her. Many people in Rosa's situation would have convinced themselves that they weren't sure what they had seen or that it wasn't their place to interfere. 6 months after the funeral that never happened, Margaret Whitmore walked into the federal courthouse for the final day of her husband's trial. The media circus that had surrounded the case since the beginning showed no signs of dying down. Reporters and camera crews lined the steps of the courthouse, hoping to capture the moment when justice would finally be served. Margaret had changed dramatically over the past 6 months. The quiet, private woman who had preferred to stay in the background was gone. In her place was someone who spoke with confidence and clarity about difficult truths. The trauma of her kidnapping and near-death experience had stripped away her willingness to hide from uncomfortable realities. She was accompanied by David and Sarah, who had supported her throughout the long legal process. Rosa Martinez walked beside them, having become an integral part of Margaret's new family structure. The bonds formed during those desperate hours of rescue had created relationships deeper than blood. Inside the courtroom, Richard Whitmore sat at the defendant's table looking like a shadow of his former self. 6 months in jail awaiting trial had taken a toll on his health and appearance. The powerful billionaire who had once controlled a vast business empire now looked like a broken old man facing the consequences of his choices. The trial had lasted 3 weeks and had revealed the full scope of Richard's criminal activities. Prosecutors had presented evidence showing that he had stolen over $15 million from various victims over a period of 12 years. The money had been used to fund his lifestyle, expand his business, and maintain his image as a successful and respectable businessman. But the theft was only part of the story. The attempted murder charges related to Margaret's kidnapping carried much more serious penalties. The prosecution had argued that Richard's plan was not just to hide Margaret temporarily, but to kill her once the funeral was over and everyone believed she was already dead. This argument was supported by testimony from Tony Marcelli, one of the men who had guarded Margaret at the warehouse. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Tony had told the court about a phone conversation where Richard had discussed eliminating the problem permanently once the heat died down. Margaret's own testimony had been the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She had spent 2 full days on the witness stand, describing her discovery of Richard's crimes, her kidnapping, and her imprisonment in the warehouse basement. Her calm, detailed account of the events had been devastating to Richard's defense. The defense attorneys had tried to argue that Richard never intended to kill Margaret, that the kidnapping was a desperate attempt to buy time while he figured out how to handle the situation. They claimed that Richard loved his wife and would never have hurt her permanently. But this argument was undermined by evidence of Richard's meticulous planning. The fake death certificate, the weighted casket, the elaborate funeral arrangements. All of it suggested careful preparation rather than a spontaneous reaction to crisis. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Santos, was known for her tough sentences in white-collar crime cases. She had presided over several high-profile corruption trials and had a reputation for holding wealthy defendants to the same standards as everyone else. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Santos said as she prepared to announce the sentence, "your crimes represent a profound betrayal of trust on multiple levels. You betrayed your business partners who trusted you with their money. You betrayed the organizations and institutions that relied on your integrity. Most seriously, you betrayed your wife, who trusted you with her life and safety." Richard stood to hear his sentence, his lawyer beside him. Marcus Webb had done his best to defend his client, but even he knew that the evidence was overwhelming. The best he could hope for was a sentence that would allow Richard some possibility of release before he died. On the charges of theft and fraud, I sentence you to 20 years in federal prison, Judge Santos continued. On the charges of kidnapping and attempted murder, I sentence you to an additional 25 years, to run consecutively with the first sentence. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. A consecutive sentence meant Richard would serve 45 years total, with no possibility of parole for at least 30 years. At 63 years old, this was effectively a life sentence. Margaret felt no satisfaction from the harsh punishment. She had wanted justice, but seeing Richard led away in shackles brought her no joy. This was the end of a 35-year marriage and the destruction of a family. Even though Richard had brought it on himself, the pain of it all was overwhelming. David put his arm around his mother as they watched his father being taken into custody. The relationship between father and son was permanently destroyed. David had tried to visit Richard in jail several times during the trial, but Richard had refused to see him. Pride and shame had made Richard unwilling to face the son whose life he had ruined. Outside the courthouse, Margaret was surrounded by reporters asking for her reaction to the verdict. She had prepared a brief statement, knowing that her words would be broadcast around the world. "Justice has been served today," Margaret said, reading from a prepared text. "But this case is about more than one man's crimes. It's about the importance of speaking up when you see wrongdoing, even when it's difficult and dangerous. I hope my experience will encourage others to find the courage to do what's right." One reporter called out, "Mrs. Whitmore, do you forgive your husband for what he did to you?" Margaret paused before answering. This was a question she had wrestled with for months. "Forgiveness is a process, not an event," she said finally. "I'm working toward it, but I'm not there yet. What Richard did was unforgivable in human terms, but I'm trying to find peace for my own sake, not his." The financial aftermath of Richard's crimes had been complex and painful. Most of his assets had been seized by the government and liquidated to compensate his victims. Margaret had lost the house where she had lived for 20 years, along with most of her personal possessions and savings. But the community response had been overwhelming. A fund established to help Margaret rebuild her life had raised over $2 million from donations around the world. People were inspired by her courage and wanted to help her start over. Margaret had used some of this money to buy a modest house on the outskirts of the city, far from the memories and publicity of her former life. The house had a large garden where she could work with her hands and find peace among growing things. Rosa had moved into the house with Margaret, officially as a housekeeper, but really as a companion and friend. The two women had grown closer during the months of legal proceedings, finding strength in their shared experience of standing up to powerful men who had tried to silence them. Dr. Peterson had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the crimes. Margaret had written a letter to the court asking for leniency, acknowledging his cooperation and apparent remorse. She believed that people could change and deserved second chances, even when they had made terrible mistakes. The private investigator who had spied on Margaret for Richard had also been prosecuted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Tony Marcelli and Jake Stevens, the men who had guarded Margaret at the warehouse, received sentences of 7 and 5 years respectively in exchange for their testimony against Richard. Margaret's book about her experience, titled Breaking the Silence, had become a bestseller. She had written it with the help of a professional author, focusing on the importance of speaking truth to power and the courage required to stand up for what's right. All profits from the book were donated to organizations that helped victims of financial crimes and domestic violence. Margaret had become an advocate for these causes, speaking at conferences and fundraising events around the country. The media attention had gradually decreased, but Margaret's story continued to resonate with people who faced their own difficult decisions about reporting wrongdoing. She received hundreds of letters from people who said her example had given them courage to speak up about corruption, abuse, and other forms of injustice in their own lives. David had struggled to rebuild his life after his father's conviction. Many of his business associates had distanced themselves from him because of the family scandal. He had lost several important clients and had been forced to sell his marketing firm. But David had found new purpose in helping his mother with her advocacy work. He managed her speaking engagements and helped coordinate the charitable foundation she had established with her book proceeds. Working together had strengthened their relationship and helped both of them heal from the trauma of Richard's betrayal. Sarah had initially considered divorcing David because of the family scandal, but she ultimately chose to stay and support him through the difficult transition. Their marriage had been tested by the stress and publicity, but it had emerged stronger than before. 1 year after the trial, Margaret received an unexpected letter from Richard in prison. It was the first communication she had received from him since his arrest. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and read his words. "Margaret," the letter began, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I am sorry for what I did to you. I was so afraid of losing everything I had built that I lost sight of everything that really mattered. I destroyed our family and hurt innocent people because I was too proud and too scared to face the consequences of my actions." The letter continued for several pages, with Richard taking full responsibility for his crimes and expressing regret for the pain he had caused. He asked nothing from Margaret except that she try to find peace and happiness in whatever life she chose to build without him. Margaret read the letter several times, looking for signs that it was another manipulation or attempt to gain sympathy. But the tone seemed genuinely remorseful, and Richard asked for nothing in return for his apology. She decided not to respond to the letter, but she kept it in a drawer beside her bed. Forgiveness was still a work in progress, but Richard's acknowledgement of his crimes was a step toward the closure she needed. 2 years after her rescue, Margaret stood in her garden planting roses similar to the ones she had been tending when her old life ended. The irony was not lost on her that roses, symbols of beauty and love, had been present at both the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. Rosa joined her in the garden, as she did most evenings when the weather was nice. They worked together in comfortable silence, two women who had found strength in friendship and shared purpose. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rosa said as they finished their work for the day, "do you ever regret speaking up about Mr. Richard's crimes? Your life would have been much simpler if you had just stayed quiet." Margaret considered the question as she cleaned the soil from her gardening tools. "No, Rosa, I don't regret it. A quiet life built on lies and stolen money isn't really living at all. I'm grateful that I found the courage to choose truth over comfort, even though it was painful." As the sun set over her new garden, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday afternoon when her world fell apart. She had lost a husband, a fortune, and the privacy she had cherished for decades. But she had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that she was capable of courage when it mattered most. The woman who had been declared dead was very much alive. More alive, in fact, than she had ever been during the years when she had lived quietly in the shadow of a man who turned out to be a stranger. Margaret Whitmore had found her voice, and she would never be silent again. In the distance, church bells were ringing, marking the end of another day. But, unlike the funeral bells that had tolled for her fake death, these bells rang with the promise of tomorrow. Margaret listened to their song and smiled, grateful for the gift of life and the chance to live it honestly. The story that began with a funeral had become a story of resurrection, not from death, but from the living death of a life built on lies. Margaret had been reborn as a woman who chose truth over comfort, justice over silence, and courage over fear. And that was the greatest victory of all. The media coverage of the case was extensive and largely sympathetic to Margaret. News outlets were fascinated by the story of a quiet housewife who had stood up to a billionaire husband and exposed his crimes. Margaret was being portrayed as a symbol of courage and integrity in a world where powerful people often seem to escape consequences for their actions. But the publicity was also taking a toll on Margaret's emotional well-being. She was staying in a hotel under police protection while her house was being searched for additional evidence. She couldn't go anywhere without being recognized and approached by reporters or curious strangers. "I just want my quiet life back," Margaret told David during one of their daily phone conversations. "I want to work in my garden and read my books and not have cameras following me everywhere I go." David understood his mother's frustration, but he also knew that her quiet life was gone forever. The woman who had been kidnapped and nearly killed by her own husband could never return to being the unknown wife of a respected businessman. Margaret Whitmore was now a public figure whether she wanted to be or not. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Richard's crimes had affected dozens of victims and hundreds of employees. The collapse of his business empire was causing economic ripple effects throughout the region. Construction projects were being delayed or canceled, and many people were losing their jobs. Margaret felt guilty about these consequences even though she knew she wasn't responsible for them. If she had never found the evidence of theft, Richard would have continued stealing, and the eventual collapse would have been even more devastating. But knowing this intellectually didn't ease the emotional burden of seeing so many people suffer because of her decision to speak up. The legal process was moving forward with unusual speed for such a complex case. Richard's lawyers were pushing for a plea agreement because they knew their client had no realistic chance of winning at trial. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the defendant had no good explanation for his actions. Margaret was preparing to testify before a grand jury that would formally indict Richard on multiple felony charges. She had spent hours with prosecutors reviewing the evidence and practicing her testimony. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining, but she was determined to see justice done. The woman who had been declared dead 5 days ago was very much alive, and she was going to make sure that the truth was told, no matter how painful it might be. Meanwhile, back at the cemetery, Richard was also under arrest. He had initially tried to claim that he was the victim of a conspiracy by Rosa and Dr. Peterson, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The empty casket, the false death certificate, the testimony of his own accomplices, and, most importantly, Margaret's own account of what had happened made his guilt undeniable. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, he passed several of the mourners who had attended what they thought was his wife's funeral. Some of them were business partners who had trusted Richard with their money. Others were friends who had respected him as a pillar of the community. All of them now looked at him with disgust and disbelief. The news media had already picked up the story. Reporters and camera crews were arriving at both the cemetery and the warehouse. The story of the billionaire who faked his wife's death was exactly the kind of sensational news that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Margaret realized that her life would never be the same. The privacy she had always cherished was gone forever. Every detail of her marriage and family life would be examined and discussed by strangers. But she was alive, and she was free, and that was what mattered most. As the ambulance prepared to take Margaret to the hospital for a more thorough examination, she looked around at the people who had saved her. Rosa, the loyal housekeeper who had risked everything to expose the truth. David, her son who had chosen to believe Rosa instead of his own father. Dr. Peterson, who had found the courage to confess his role in the crime. Miguel and his friends, who had responded immediately when Rosa asked for help. "Thank you," Margaret said to each of them. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The warehouse district grew quiet as the police cars and ambulance departed. The abandoned building where Margaret had been held prisoner was now marked with yellow crime scene tape. Inside, investigators would continue searching for additional evidence that might be used in Richard's prosecution. But the most important evidence was Margaret herself. She was alive, she was safe, and she was ready to tell the world exactly what kind of man Richard Whitmore really was. The billionaire who had seemed so powerful and untouchable was about to discover that some crimes could not be covered up, no matter how much money and influence you had. The funeral that was supposed to bury Margaret's secrets had instead exposed them to the light. And now, justice would finally have its chance. A few pieces of his mother's jewelry. The mourners gasped and stepped back in shock. Some of the elderly guests looked like they might collapse from the revelation. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, grabbing David's arm for support. "She really is alive." David turned to face his father with a look of pure fury. "Where is she?" he demanded. "What have you done with my mother?" But Richard was no longer listening. He was running toward his limousine, hoping to escape before the police could be called. The cemetery security guards, finally, understanding what was happening, moved to intercept him. Rosa was already running toward her car. "Follow me," she shouted to David. "I'll take you to where they're keeping her." As the crowd of mourners watched in amazement, the funeral of Margaret Whitmore transformed into a rescue mission. Margaret was alive, and now everyone knew it. The question was whether they could reach her before Richard's accomplices realized that their plan had been exposed. Most importantly, Rosa had seen something that no one else knew about. On Tuesday morning, before Margaret's supposed death, Rosa had overheard a phone conversation between Richard and someone else. Richard had been speaking in a low, angry voice about needing to take care of the Margaret problem before she could destroy everything. At the time, Rosa had thought Richard was talking about some business issue. Margaret sometimes worried about Richard's business practices and would express her concerns to him. Rosa assumed this was just another one of their disagreements about money and ethics. But now, standing in the back of the church and looking at Margaret's closed casket, Rosa was beginning to understand that the conversation had meant something much more sinister. She was starting to suspect that Margaret wasn't really dead at all. Rosa had tried to see Margaret's body at the funeral home, but Richard had given strict instructions that no one except family members could view the remains. Even Rosa, who had been like a member of the family for 15 years, was turned away. This seemed cruel and unnecessary, which wasn't like the Richard Whitmore that Rosa thought she knew. As the final prayer ended and people began to file out of the church, Rosa slipped out the back door ahead of the crowd. She needed time to think and decide what to do with her suspicions. If she was wrong, she could lose her job and her reputation. But if she was right, Margaret might be in terrible danger. Rosa walked quickly to her old car parked 3 blocks away from the cathedral. As she drove home, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find Margaret Whitmore, whether she was dead or alive. And if Margaret was alive and being held somewhere against her will, Rosa was going to rescue her, no matter what it cost. The funeral procession moved slowly through the city streets toward the cemetery where Margaret was supposed to be buried. The expensive hearse led a line of black cars filled with mourners. At the front of the procession, Richard Whitmore sat in his limousine with his son and daughter-in-law, playing the role of a grieving widower. But in the basement of the abandoned warehouse, Margaret Whitmore was very much alive, and she was beginning to plan her own rescue.